Good morning and welcome everyone to the webinar, Different Tools for Different Questions, Using Alternatives Assessment, Risk Assessment, and Lifecycle Assessment. My name is Lauren Hine. I'm a director at Chem Forward, a nonprofit-led supply chain collaboration to scale access to chemical hazard information on safer chemical alternatives. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment, or A4. A4 is a professional society dedicated to advancing the science, practice, and policy of alternatives assessment and informed substitution. A4 is an interdisciplinary community of researchers and practitioners from government agencies, academia, industry, nonprofits, working collaboratively to accelerate the transition to the use of safer chemicals, materials, products, and processes. A4 welcomes members from a broad range of scientific disciplines involved in alternatives assessment and informed substitution. These include toxicology, exposure science, engineering, chemistry, life cycle assessment, law, policy, economics, and more. Please see our website, saferalternatives.org, and consider becoming a member. Next slide, please. Great. A4 is offering about 4 webinars a year. This is our second webinar. All webinars are recorded and freely available on the A4 website, including the slides. Today's topic was recommended by participants in the A4 Planning Committee, which is co-chaired by Margaret Whitaker of Tox Services and myself, and staffed by Molly Jacobs. Peter Fantke, a member of the Planning Committee, an expert in quantitative sustainability assessment, and faculty at the Technical University of Denmark, will pose questions to the speakers and facilitate the discussion. The goal of today's webinar is to provide perspectives on what makes alternatives assessment, AA, risk assessment, RA, and life cycle assessment, LCA, both distinct and complementary. AA, RA, and LCA are allied fields that each aim to improve human and environmental health by evaluating and comparing impacts for chemicals, products, or processes. Despite their high-level overlapping objectives, each field goes about achieving its objectives with a different set of methods and boundaries and approaches. Please note that we are not ignoring chemical hazard assessment. We are treating chemical hazard assessment as a subset of risk assessment. Chemical hazard assessment can be a first pass for screening chemicals that, depending on results, may or may not be subsequently further evaluated for exposure and risk. And I'm sure you'll hear more about this. Next slide, please. Using an interactive panel format, we have 3 experts from industry who will share how they use approaches to achieve their company's chemical management and sustainability objectives. We're really thrilled to have Libby Sommer, Director of Corporate Responsibility at Bolt Threads, Martin Wolf, Director of Sustainability and Authenticity at 7th Generation, and Annie Bevan, Global Head of Sustainability at Superior Essex. Sorry, Bevan. And next slide, please. So all of you are muted at this time due to the large number of participants. If you wish to ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A box located in the drop-down control panel at the top of the screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the panel discussion. As I mentioned, this webinar is recorded and will be posted along with the slide deck on our website, saferalternatives.org. And at the end of the webinar, we'll launch a very short survey to get your input on future webinar topics and additional feedback. We would be very grateful if you would just hang on for less than a minute. It's a very short survey. Okay, so before we start, we have a polling question for you to get a better feel for which of these methods you have used. And then after the polling question, I'll turn this over to Peter Fanke to kick off the discussion. Thank you. Molly? So it looks like we have, great, 88% have used hazard and risk assessment, 46% life cycle assessment, 56% have used alternatives assessment, and 10% have used other. Okay, Peter, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Lauren, for the introduction, and indeed quite interesting poll results already that we see here. So let's start with the perspective of the three panelists. We start with Libby Sommer. She's Director of Corporate Responsibility at Bold Threads. And this is a materials company focused on producing more environmentally sustainable materials from natural sources. For example, we have spider silk, we have mushrooms that were used there. Libby brings her experience from working in the apparel industry and also for the government to set the direction for corporate responsibility at her company, really. These concepts and goals are embedded in the research, process development, and also in product development that goes into exciting products like Milo, Bold's mushroom-based alternative to leather, for example. Libby, please go ahead. Floor is all yours.
Great, thank you. Can we go to the first slide, Molly? I'm excited to be here to talk about how we use these tools at Bold Threads. We are a small startup. Some of you may have heard of Bolt, some of you may not have. I got familiar with Bolt when I was working as an independent consultant on green chemistry, and I went down there and visited Bolt Threads and talked to them about what green chemistry is, and really was excited about the company, and said to myself, I'm going to work there someday. And about 2 years later, I am working there. We have a really great team at Bolt Threads. It's a unique mix of people from academia to more PhD kind of research scientists, as well as apparel folks like myself. And we are at the intersection of biotechnology and apparel and textiles. We got our start with spider silk. That was really where Bolt kind of grew up from. And spider silk is really, really interesting for a number of reasons. One of the most interesting things from a sustainability standpoint is that you can change the order of amino acids in a silk protein. These are all proteins that are biomimetically produced in a yeast fermentation process. And you can change the order of those amino acids to get different properties in the spider silk protein. So theoretically can make proteins that are really stretchy, like spandex, or water repellent, or extremely durable. There's a lot of amazing properties with spider silk proteins. We've done a few example products with our spider silk protein thread. So we've made a dress with Stella McCartney and Adidas earlier this year. There was a release on that. We've got a dress, another one with Stella McCartney that's in MoMA in New York. And we've also discovered that the silk protein has some really interesting properties from a skincare perspective. It increases elasticity in the skin, also increases hydration, and we have some clinical data to back that up. So we currently have a skincare line that we call 18B, which is named after the spider silk protein, that's available direct to consumer on our website. What I'm going to talk about today is our latest product. We call it Milo, and it's a mushroom-based material. Mycelia is really the more correct term. and it's an alternative to leather. And this is an example product that we produced called the Milo Driver Bag. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit more about what Milo is and how we use lifecycle assessment, risk assessment, hazard assessment, alternative assessment, all these tools. The way that Milo is grown is really in a growing process, and so that makes it a little bit different, I guess, than the way that natural leather is produced, of course, by raising cattle and slaughtering them and then processing the hide. What we start from is the fungal spores. So mycelium is essentially the root structure in a mushroom. It's the part that you never see. We're so familiar with the fruiting body portion of a mushroom. You know, when you go into a grocery store, those are all fruiting bodies. But what that mushroom grows on is mycelia, and mycelia is sort of an underground network of hypha, of fibers that grow and create a structure for that mushroom and help pull resources from the ground to grow that mushroom fruiting body. What we're doing is trying to grow just that mycelia, so not the fruiting body itself. And we grow that on a bed of agricultural waste and other byproducts. The spores grow in about 9 days. So after 9 days, we get a mat that in step 3 here in my slide, the mat actually looks much thicker and wider than that. These mats on this slide have been compressed. But it's this sort of spongy, marshmallowy kind of texture to the mat. And then we compress that and we cure it and dye it to make Milo. And so the picture in step 4 is what that material looks like. We're in the process of scaling this up to have commercial product out in the marketplace by the end of 2020. And so in doing that scale up, we use all of these tools. We use hazard assessment, absolutely, particularly in the selection of chemistry that goes into the product. We can make, theoretically, just as they do with leather, which is a natural product from cows, you can make it as hazardous as you want with the most hazardous chemistry. So we're trying to be really intentional and choose the greenest chemistry we possibly can to cure and dye this product. And that's a really, really important part of the value proposition of this, of Milo. We use risk assessment in making sure that the chemicals that workers are exposed to in these production processes are safe. And we'll do more risk assessment, especially as we get to the commercial level, to make sure the product is also safe. We're doing a lifecycle assessment really in the middle of that right now. And that, as a first pass, is meant to inform the design of our production processes. You know, we want to revolutionize not only the starting materials and use something that's really unique like mushrooms, but also revolutionize what's arguably a pretty dirty process when it comes to apparel and footwear production, generally speaking, and make processes that are as sustainable as they possibly can be. And lifecycle assessment is a really, really valuable tool in doing that. It helps us understand where our hot spots are, and then helps us think about, okay, what can we do to reduce those hot spots? So we're using all of these tools. Probably the last thing I'll say before we hand it over to the next speaker is I tend to think of alternative assessment as kind of an umbrella that pulls from a lot of different tools that includes lifecycle assessment, hazard assessment, risk assessment, social ROI, total cost accounting. There's so many tools that can go into the evaluation of alternatives. And for us, that idea of alternative assessment is not so much looking at what's already been done, but because we're a new material producer and we're coming up with a new process, we're looking at what we can do, what we can do, design into with all those tools to make the best informed choices. So turn it over, I guess, to the next speaker.
Thanks, Libby. That was very interesting also to hear that you actually in your company use all three approaches. So we come back to that after Martin and Annie have also introduced their perspectives on it. I'm really keen to hear more about this. Thanks a lot for your presentation. Our next speaker, our next panelist is Martin Wolf. He is Director of Sustainability and Authenticity and responsible for ensuring the design of sustainable products at 7th Generation. This is a manufacturing and distributing company for ecological household and personal care products. And Martin there has developed frameworks for environmental product design, helped educate his own co-workers, but also customers and consumers about the environmental impacts of consumer products mostly. He also helped develop standards for voluntary ingredient disclosure, brought change into the cleaning products industry through more sustainable product design, and so on. Finally, he has also served on a number of external science and advisory committees, including an appointment by the National Academy of Science to serve on its committee for the design and evaluation of safer chemical substitutions. Thanks, Martin, for being here. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, and hello, everyone. Something that I think most people that are actually in companies that make formulated products, as 7th Generation does, knows is that we're constantly using alternatives assessment as we formulate products. We look at the different properties that we need to bring to the product that we're designing. We look at the costs. We look at compatibility with packaging, safety for the people handling the product in our factories, as well as the people using the product. What companies don't specifically state that is true is that the alternative decisions that are being made as the product is designed reflects the values and mission of the company. And this is an important point of differentiation among companies generally and 7th Generation specifically. So if I can move to the next slide, what you see here on the right is a Venn diagram that we use to describe our product development process. When we're selecting ingredients and when we're evaluating the product we make, we certainly look at the cost and the performance of those materials. And every company does this because we want to provide the greatest performance at the lowest cost for the consumer. And as we all know, there's typically a spectrum of products, whether it's laundry detergents, where you have premium brands and value brands, or automobiles, where you have luxury automobiles and more basic transportation. So what 7th Generation does beyond this cost performance analysis is consideration of the health and environmental aspects of the ingredients we use and the products that we put into the marketplace. Of course, all companies do this also. The question is, do you simply meet regulatory requirements or do you go beyond that? And if you go beyond that, how much further do you go? So when we consider this, we look at our mission, and the mission of our company is to create a healthy, sustainable, and equitable place for the next 7 generations. So the keys to that mission are health, sustainability, and equity. So beginning with health, when we look at an ingredient, we look at its toxicity profile, and we look at it from primarily the standpoint of its chronic toxicity. And the reason for this is that chronic toxicities often don't have what's called a threshold. That is, current models of carcinogenicity do not say there's a level below which there is no risk of harm, but rather we look at the probability of harm. And companies use the hazard of a material and the pathways of exposure from the product to determine a certain likelihood of harm, like 1 in 100,000 excess tumors in a population. And seventh generation feels that because of the uncertainty in those calculations, we certainly don't know how people are going to use our products and what are the products they're going to use along with ours, or what chemicals they're exposed to just in their daily lives. We're better off from the standpoint of health of not using chronically toxic materials. So the first thing we do is a green screen style assessment or hazard assessment. And if we see an ingredient has chronic toxicity, we don't use it as an ingredient. And we also work with our upstream suppliers to see that these materials are not used as what are called incidental ingredients. So they're not present in our products. Beyond that, we have to look at the toxicity of our product itself. Having eliminated the chronic toxicants, we now have to worry about the acute toxicity or the acute hazard of our product. Is it very caustic or very acidic? What is the oral toxicity or the dermal toxicity of the product? And we use a variety of assessment techniques, such as in vitro techniques for skin irritancy and ocular irritancy, as well as repeat insult patch tests, where we use human volunteers after we've ascertained there is no indication of sensitization or irritation from the in vitro tests. We'll use patch tests to show that indeed the product is not irritating. And we use calculation methods to make sure that the acute oral toxicity is above typically 5,000 milligrams per kilogram, which is typically viewed as relatively non-toxic, and often there's a regulatory threshold at 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. So we're using those hazard assessments for both the chronic toxicity and the acute toxicity of our products. But we also look at the risks at times. Sometimes you can't eliminate a substance you know to be hazardous, and you therefore have to look at the exposure pathways, and the combination of hazard and exposure give you the bases for making an assessment of risk. So if we can't eliminate a hazard at the start, we'll assess the likelihood of exposure and the probability of risk so that we are comfortable that the product will not cause excessive harm. And if we fail that risk assessment, or if it's inconclusive because we're uncertain about the pathways of exposure or the actual hazards of the ingredients due to what we call data gaps, then we'll use precaution and not use an ingredient at all. So moving from health and assessments of health, we look at the environment, and we have as a core of our aspirations to achieve a sustainable environment the idea of working in nature's cycles or in technical cycles. So we try to use bio-based ingredients to the extent possible, which can then biodegrade when they are in the environment, so that they can become plant nutrients. We can collect the oils and make more bio-based ingredients, etc. And for our packaging, we will start with post-consumer recycled plastic or paperboard, make our packaging, which would then again be recyclable, so that if properly managed by our consumers and put in a recycling bin, the materials become available for reuse. So while that process in itself doesn't have a specific assessment that we do, more broadly, when we look at packaging alternatives, we use life cycle assessment, which looks at the impact of these materials from the beginning, their extraction as raw materials from the earth, petroleum in the case of most plastics, to the conversion of that raw material into a functional ingredient, and then the distribution and use of that ingredient, and ultimately its disposal. And while that technique is quite good for something like a global environmental impact, such as global warming potential, it's not particularly useful from the standpoint of toxicity and health perspective, because you're looking at cumulative amounts of material and not at all at exposure pathways. And the moment you focus in on a specific location with a specific chemical and a specific route of exposure, you're no longer looking at a life cycle assessment, but you're now back to doing a standard hazard assessment and exposure assessment, leading to a calculation of risk. But what life cycle assessment also forces you to do is map the materials that are going into your product, so you can identify hot spots where you might want to do a more detailed hazard and exposure assessment. And finally, though I somewhat glibly said at the beginning that everyone who formulates a product is doing an alternatives assessment, in fact, typically, once you've made a decision and started making a product, that assessment is essentially forgotten and the product formulation is codified. But companies constantly reassess their formulas for performance and cost against the competitive marketplace. And as we all know, we often find that a material that we thought was relatively low hazard has a greater hazard than initially considered. And this is where the formalized alternatives assessment that A4 thinks about comes in, where we have a product and we are now aware of a hazard or a risk from that product's use. Can we find materials that eliminate or at least reduce that risk of harm while maintaining the performance and functionality of the product? So that is how we use risk assessment, life cycle assessment, and alternatives assessment at 7th generation.
Thanks, Martin. That is very interesting. Also, you seem to use indeed all three processes or three tools, even though already without naming it that way. You have used alternative assessment specifically already a long time in your product design processes. That's very great. So we come back to that after also Annie has introduced her perspective on these aspects and these three frameworks. So I'm introducing our last panelist now, Annie Bevan, and she's Global Head of Sustainability at Superior Essex. She's widely regarded in the industry as an expert in sustainability program development, but also corporate social responsibility and third-party verification. She oversees at Superior Essex the sustainability program, which is working to collaborate and accelerate the sustainability platform through engagement with both consumers and suppliers. In addition to her work at the company, she sits as a technical advisor and collaborator with a number of different organizations. For example, the Green Buildings Council's Material and Resources tag for the LED rating system, but also the International Living Future Institute, Department of Defense, General Service Administration, Green Production Actions, Green Screen Program, and so on and so on. Annie, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Lauren Hine and Meg Whitaker, two of my heroes in my career, so I appreciate them asking me to join them today. I have something that most people would regard as much less exciting than mushroom technology or 7th generation, who's done some amazing work branding and really executing sustainability for consumer markets to understand. I'm here today as the Global Head of Sustainability for Superior Essex. Superior Essex, our tagline is that we believe that the technology that connects the world should also respect it. If you go to the next slide there, we are one of the largest data communication cable manufacturers in the world. So we have quite a spread of products and manufacturers on the call today. And our concept that we like to spread is that communication cabling is actually everywhere you live and work. Though our products are not that exciting, nor do you really interact with them, the function of the products you do interact with every day. And I would argue at this point in time, without communication cable, we would not have many of the luxuries that we enjoy. We're currently providing the broadband network, or the piping behind the broadband network, providing and updating our networks to be on the 5G. So outside copper, and so some of our largest customers are AT&T and Verizon. And then we also work on the building side of things. So inspired by the LEED rating system and how communication cabling products can contribute to LEED, how can communication cable products and its applications contribute to the WELL building standard, and then also Living Building Challenge certification as well. So we do provide both sustainable products, which I'm going to talk to you about today. How do we define sustainable products? And also smart building solutions. So how can communication cable provide both power and data to end devices to enable controls, sensors, and data analytics throughout the built environment as well, all supporting those green building rating systems that we mentioned today. So more of a focus in the conversation today on the enterprise side, because that's ultimately where a lot of this is being driven from, but also seeing this conversation in terms of lifecycle impacts and alternatives assessment creep into our broadband and working with broadband side of the business, working with Verizon and AT&T to provide the most sustainable backbone to these networks is also really an interesting conversation evolution that we're seeing as well in the market. Next slide. So our journey in this started about, since about 2012. It was at that time that the LEED, believe it or not, LEED version 4, which is still not the rating system out there for LEED, started to become a topic of conversation in the market. And at that time, the architect and design community was sending letters to building product manufacturers saying, if you do not have an environmental product declaration or a health product declaration, because that's how products can contribute to the materials and resources section within the LEED rating system, we're not going to specify you. So ultimately, Superior Essex then responded to our customers, and one of the first and only communication cable manufacturer on the market to have and understand our total environmental impacts and then be transparent about those through environmental product declarations. So the summarization of our total lifecycle impacts in a report that is then transparent about those impacts. And then we also have 55 product families that have health product declarations. So what is in our products in terms of compositional chemistry, and then how are we transparently disclosing that information to the marketplace? What type of green screen list translator hazards are associated with it, with the chemistries within our products? And I can say after publishing these in 2014, it was a very eye-opening experience to understand then where do our life cycle impacts really come from. And actually, it comes from our copper extraction. The biggest impacts is certainly in our raw material extraction. So over the past years, since 2014, we've been working with our supply chain and our manufacturing facilities to try and understand how can we then reduce those impacts. So these were the starts of our understanding of our total environmental impacts and total human health impacts, and it was driven by our customers. What is the total life cycle impacts of your products, and what's the human health impacts of your products? That was driven ultimately by the LEED rating system, and now has evolved pretty significantly that many architects and designers are making specification decisions based on just having transparency alone. Additionally, then we've evolved that message to also understand how do our products relate and contribute to other green building standards like WELL and like Living Building Challenge. So we are the only communication cable manufacturer that offers completely red list free products on the market, so contributing to Living Building Challenge. So that's how we communicate with another sector of the market who's using the red list as a guiding principle to making purchasing decisions for building products. So have you eliminated 800 of the worst acting chemicals as defined by the International Future Institute's red list? and purchasing based off of that list and products that don't have chemicals on that list. So our Declare products and our Living Product Challenge certifications help us communicate that to the market, that we've actually not only don't have red list chemistry in some of our products, but also then can communicate that transparently through those platforms. Next slide. But ultimately, what I've loved about the environment is this drive for transparency. But what I don't like about this the built environment is a drive for transparency, because transparency is only transparency. It's not actually what have you done to be better. So at Superior Essex, we're taking a lot of thoughtful approaches, and as I started to talk about in terms of environmental impact, on how do we not only talk about our impacts, but how do we improve and reduce our impacts ultimately. So if you go to the next slide, we have joined the Materials Carbon Action Network. So I'm not sure how familiar this group is with the built environment, but there is now a huge focus with a lot of the alarming changes that we're seeing in weather patterns and anomalies, to move on to not only just talk about operational carbon in the built environment, so how are we reducing energy to reduce carbon impacts based on performance of the building, but also what is the carbon impacts of the products you're using to build that building. That is the embodied carbon then. So taking and looking at our life cycle assessment and EPD information at the global warming potential, identifying what is the biggest cause for those environmental impacts, and then looking to reduce and work with our supply chain, work with our manufacturing facility to reduce that embodied carbon number. And the market in terms of the built environment is really significantly looking for this information. There are many who are committing to not only just looking at operational performance in buildings, but embodied performance in buildings and assessing buildings on a whole building life cycle assessment basis. And Superior Essex is really proud of this work that we've been doing over the past couple of years, is not only just getting a life cycle assessment, but leveraging that information and making impact reductions in both our supply chain and within our manufacturing operations. Next slide. In addition, and you don't have to read this slide, but I think everyone likely has heard about some concerns over the use of PVC in terms of human health hazards throughout the supply chain. And in our work to provide red list free products, due to code and burn rates and all these things, to use an alternative jacketing material for cabling, the most commonly used jacketing material is in fact PVC. To use an alternative, we had to work very significantly with our supply chain to find an alternative that not only is in fact red list free, but also is meeting the code as well. So, however, the opportunity in the design of the plenum space, which we don't need to get into the details of that, is FEP, in which case then has traditionally, there has been concern within that classification of chemistry overall as well with the PFOAs as well. So we've done a lot of work with our suppliers to actually assess our FEP to ensure that this is not in fact a regrettable substitution to PVC, based on various criteria with our customers as well. And it's been really interesting engaging with building owners in this conversation who actually have now chemists on staff to better understand what types of products they're purchasing and what is the impact, the potential impact of human health based on that product purchase. It's really an interesting dialogue. So we are looking at various alternatives and ensuring through various methodologies that this in fact, and in collaboration with our suppliers to ensure that it is the alternatives that we're using and the products that we're using mainly are not regrettable as well. Next slide. And we're doing a lot of work in the sustainable PVC realm as well. So again, not getting into the details, nor wanting to mention those today, but PVC in general has had some concerns throughout the value chain. I think there's a lot of technological advancements that's cleaning PVC up significantly. However, we are working with the likes of GC3 and other industry standards to define what is the most sustainable PVC that's available on the market today, and acknowledging some of those issues in the supply chain and sourcing these sustainable PVC materials from our supply chain as well. So it's really been great to have, again, collaborations with our suppliers and other manufacturers in the industry to help better define what is in fact sustainable PVC, and looking to specify and use those materials to develop our products as well. And I think that's all, and I'll hand it back over to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Annie. That was very insightful. Also to see that you not always name it as we have listed the methods here, like lifecycle assessment, but you clearly look at supply chain impacts here. So you do in fact exactly that. That's very interesting. So also you have a broad spectrum of tools that you try to use and see how you can take the best out of that. That's great. So thanks a lot to all three of you. I will now open a little bit of a discussion with you. I will file in some questions that we have thought about beforehand to see that you actually talk a little bit more in depth about specifics on the three methods and tools, AA, LCA, and risk assessment. And after that, I hope we have time for that. We have an additional launch poll. I'm sure we will have, we can do that to also reactivate the audience a bit more about one or two questions that are really interesting here. And in the end, I will also ask 2-3 questions posed by the audience that I find here in the chats. So I hope I will not miss any of this. So let's start. So each of you really revealed insights on how you're using in your company the different approaches. So I think it's really interesting now to know a bit more. Where do you think, what are the key issues that make each of the three approaches really distinct? I mean, you're using them here and there to answer specific questions. Can you tease out and summarize perhaps in a little bit more concrete way what makes these three approaches really distinct? What are the general principles that define each field really, and the classical steps in the different methods? And please go ahead as you wish in which order you like. Libby, Martin, Annie.
Sure, I'm glad to jump in. This is Martin. And by the way, my name is spelled W-O-L-F like the animal, not as it is on that slide. That said, the three analytical methods have very different, what I'll call substrates or things that you're analyzing. So a risk assessment looks at the hazard of the materials that you're using, and then the exposure pathways that are possible to give you some estimate of the likelihood of harm from that particular material. So it's highly material and product specific and application specific. Life cycle analysis certainly begins with the product and the materials that are in it, but then looks at the impacts all along the life cycle chain, or maybe I should say the life circle chain, if we look at recycling and bio-based, biodegradable materials, and looks primarily at what inputs and outputs, meaning intermediate products and especially emissions to the environment, occur at each stage in the process of putting that product together and using it in the real world. And you lose the specificity that you had about the risk of harm from each of the individual materials, but rather are now looking at a collective or aggregated set of harms, typically called the life cycle inventory, and even removing it even further from the likelihood of a particular harm from an individual substance. In life cycle assessment, what you do is essentially translate the hazard of a material to the hazard of a standard material. So if you're working with a carcinogen like 1,4-dioxane, the life cycle assessment doesn't report the carcinogenicity of 1,4-dioxane, but rather it translates it to the relative toxicity compared to dichlorobenzene. And that way they can take the carcinogenicity, or generally the toxicity, of many different substances and translate it into a single hazard level. Much like we use money, money doesn't describe any specific cost along our supply chain, but gives you a uniform basis of comparison. And then finally, alternatives assessment begins by assuming some combination of materials or ingredients in a product and looks at the likelihood of harm caused by the individual substances in that product, and then using other tools and aggregating the results of those different analytical tools comes up with the ability to assess the relative risk of harm from replacing one material with a different material. Starting with risk assessment again, you're looking at individual materials and their likelihood to cause harm. Life cycle analysis, you're looking at an entire supply chain and its likelihood of causing harm, primarily on an environmental level. And then finally, alternatives assessment uses each of those tools and other tools so that you can improve the risk performance of the material or product that you've made. So I hope that was clear.
I just wanted to add something to that, because as Martin was talking, this is Libby Sommer at Bolt Threads. As Martin was talking, I realized a significant difference in the kinds of products that he is producing at 7th Generation versus what we're doing at Bolt Threads. And Annie and I are probably more in a similar category than the kinds of products that Martin makes, which are in general a lot of chemical formulations, right? And for us, we use chemical formulations, but that's as things like a dye or a fat liquor or something like that. When you look at the whole life cycle of the production of that material, chemistry in general tends to be pretty minute in terms of the life cycle impacts in a material, generally speaking, and that is not always the case, but in generalities, that can be true. And it kind of makes sense in a way when you think about something like dyeing, like that process, dyeing a material. There's a lot of heat that goes into the process to heat water. Dyeing is almost always a water-based process, so there's a lot of water impacts. So when you look across all of the impact categories that a life cycle assessment looks at, chemistry may not register very high in there. That's one of the reasons why I don't use that exclusively to choose chemistry. In fact, I put a lot more weight on hazard assessment and risk assessment when it comes to chemical selection. We still include chemistry in our life cycle assessment, but it's not sort of registering on that very high. Life cycle assessment is really an average of averages, so it's not so surprising that it doesn't show up in a strong way there. But I thought that was worth mentioning, just in terms of that difference in product. A product like yours, Martin, would be one additive into our whole production process. So it's a little bit different. A different look at very, very different materials.
That's a very good point. And actually, we both have to acknowledge that it's actually the consumer use of hot water when cleaning their spider silk product that impacts the life cycle the most, more than either the 7th generation detergent or the materials that you're making. And I'm confident both our companies are working on solutions to that problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, with Milo, there isn't going to be washing, just like there isn't with leather. So it's a little bit different in the use phase, but yeah, absolutely, that use phase can have a big impact on the life cycle.
Thanks, both of you. Annie, do you want to add anything? No need to, but if you like.
No, that was fantastic. I felt like that was well addressed. Thank you.
That's great. I mean, what you already partly started to address here is what the specific challenges are in each of these different tools. When I understand lifecycle assessment is really using a lot of averages, generic values, because it's really dealing with a broader set of impact categories, as I understand, and looking at the whole life cycle and full supply chain, and not just one specific aspect like a worker role here, a consumer role there. Then, of course, there are very different challenges making sense of that in a different way than you can do with risk assessment results. Looking at the challenges a little bit, where do you see actually synergies and overlaps in these approaches? Because you highlighted, all three of you, that they are used for answering actually distinct questions, but there must be some synergies or overlaps perhaps in, for example, using data or mechanistic process-based understanding in these analytical tools, as Martin said, or something else. Have you any experience with that, where we can actually harvest synergies to boost alternatives assessment as an emerging field, really, by looking at what has been done and what is being done in risk assessment and LCA?
Yeah, this is Annie. So I think that that's an interesting question. And I think that a lot of times when going to the market, I'm either talking about just life cycle impacts or just human health impacts. But I believe that there's actually a significant overlap in both, and a holistic conversation does need to start occurring on the benefits or negatives surrounding an alternative versus life cycle impact. They all overlap, in which case one product, you could be alternatively using another material to have a lower human health impact, but alternatively that life cycle impact of that product could then be higher based on where you supply it from or impacts, or vice versa. You could be looking to provide a lower impact on a life cycle basis product to the market, but that might in turn then have some negative health impacts, or there could be both positives or both negatives. So these tools ultimately work together, in which case I think we need to start holistically in the market having a conversation where these tools and conversations intersect a little bit more heavily, because I think that we all need to start making and understanding decisions with all of the information in front of us, not just one or the other. I don't know what the other panelists have to say about that, but that's ultimately where I see us, and specifically in the built environment, going as well.
Thanks, Annie. I think that's really perhaps one of the key aspects where we can harvest some synergies in the future, because it's all about trade-offs in the end, and that we do not improve something, an aspect, let's say some chemical safety, and have a worse performance in another field or part of the entire system. I think that is a huge challenge across the fields, actually, that you highlight here, that we can use to create some synergies and looking at the tools and what they're specifically looking at and address in terms of environmental performance, but also other performance indicators when looking at a substitution context, for example. Interesting. I would like to activate a little bit more the audience again. So Molly, would you please be throwing in the poll, the other poll here, that we can really see how we can boost more the alternatives assessment field itself. Thanks, Molly. Let's look at the results. So it's about the added value of alternatives assessment. In addition to the rather mature fields of LCA for more than 25, 30 years, and risk assessment even longer, of course. So it informs which alternatives are safer and feasible. So it is really about being safer, but also being feasible. So really as also the technological and the economic aspects here, 80% interesting. It addresses also an array of health and environmental impacts. So that it has really in common with LCA as I see it here. Includes key business elements, safety, cost, and performance, which is clear that it then really looks at a broad set of performance indicators going beyond the environmental domain. So most people really see a lot of added value across the points that were posed here. The three panelists, Libby, Martin, Annie, what do you think about? So what do you think really about these questions? Do you think there is really a strong added value in using alternatives assessment?
This is Libby. Yes, and I think our definitions could vary in terms of what alternatives assessment means to each of us. I'll kind of repeat what I said earlier, that I see alternatives assessment as a way of thinking about various options and weighing the impacts and the trade-offs that pulls from lifecycle assessment and lots of other tools, risk assessment, hazard assessment. The last one kind of struck me as interesting. It considers material and technology options beyond chemicals. I would say absolutely alternatives assessment does that. It's also incredibly challenging because we're talking about very different pieces of data. How do I weigh water use with chemical use? You know, those are such different things. And it all kind of comes down to values. We're actually in the middle of doing that right now, looking at do we prefer a chemical process for something or a mechanical process? And the chemistry that's used is relatively benign. It would be something like a green screen, you know, benchmark-free kind of chemical. And then the physical process doesn't require added chemistry. So it's a really interesting situation of which one is more sustainable. What I think that we might choose at this point is we want to understand how much the energy that goes into that physical process impacts the overall energy burden in our life cycle assessment, and if that's really significant, and adding that process would add a significant burden in terms of creation of global warming compounds, then we might prefer the chemical process. You know, alternatively, if that's not very energy intensive, that might actually be a better process than the chemical process. So those are some of the things that we're weighing right now. And that's not to say that that's the exact right way to think about that. I'm sure there's other ways to think about that too, but that just stuck out to me as kind of an interesting one where I think it is part of alternative assessment, but also really, really difficult and kind of new uncharted territory for a lot of people.
Right. Thanks for that insight. That actually brings me to, I have only time for one, but it's an exciting one, a question from the audience. Can each of one of you quickly, if possible, give one example of a successful replacement that you experience on your side of a hazardous material? Anything that you really love and would like to convey?
I can. At seventh generation, more than a decade ago, we were using a surfactant called sodium lauryl ether sulfate, and a byproduct of the production of that surfactant is a carcinogen, 1,4-dioxane, and we specified an extremely low level of contamination, and very few companies were willing to sell us material that met that specification. But we found two, and we were very proud of the work that we did. And then an NGO published the levels of contamination found in many different products, and we were at one of the lowest. And I thought, we're doing such a good job controlling that carcinogen. And then all of our actual customers, consumers, started calling and saying, you may have been low, but we don't want any in our product. So we started an alternatives assessment, and we ended up replacing the sodium lauryl ether sulfate with a material called sodium lauryl sulfate. And there were some formulation challenges that had to be overcome, but about a year and a half later, we introduced our reformulated both laundry and hand dish products. So that's an example that I'm actually, how shall I say, embarrassed by, but also proud of.
Thanks, Martin. Anyone else wanted to say something about an example?
I'll just say quickly, we don't have a commercial product on the marketplace yet. So the way that I would answer that question is about the chemicals that we're selecting for further development. So I'll get our research scientists will send me a list of, say, 10 to 20 options, and we'll use hazard assessment to identify the ones that are the most hazardous and the ones that are the least hazardous. And they've used that to filter through those options and to target the least hazardous options and do further development there. We've done that with dyes, with fat liquors, with lots of different chemicals.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that. So unfortunately, we are already at the top of the hour. So I'm handing over back to Lauren, who will close the webinar. Thank you so much, all the 3 panelists.
Yes, thank you for that really interesting and insightful discussion. I know I've taken away a lot of interesting ideas from it. And thank you, Peter, for an excellent job facilitating. Our next webinar will be sometime in January. We haven't set a date yet, but it should be very interesting, addressing data gaps in chemical hazard assessment as used in alternatives assessment. Can you identify safer chemicals using non-animal test methods, some of this new assessment methodology in toxicology? And if you would all be kind enough to just stay on for 1 more minute, it's going to be like another poll question. It's very brief. We'd appreciate your feedback, and it will help guide future webinars that we select. Thank you to our planning team and to Molly for all your great coordination and leadership here. And here's please join the A4 if you can. And we're going to be having a workshop in about a year, and the last one was extremely successful and well attended. So join and stay informed, and please respond to this very brief poll. Thank you all very, very much for joining today.